word church is a religious word, not a biblical word. The word church does not belong in the Bible. Let's talk about it now. Hello, my name is Larry Overton. Thank you for checking out our channel, Reclaiming First Century Christianity. Topic of discussion, let's get right into it. The word church is a religious term. It is a religious word. It is not a biblical word. We'll start by looking at the word itself, church. Of course, we're talking about the English language, but that English word was derived from other Germanic languages, which was derived from Latin. Ultimately, it goes back to the Greek. Let's trace that etymology. Let's look at the origins here. The word church is ultimately taken from the Greek word kyriakos. That is an adjective in the Greek of the New Testament, in the Greek language, that means of the Lord or belonging to the Lord. Now, the word we have, church, comes from the Greek term going back to even first century times, which meant belonging to the Lord. Sounds good so far. It is found in the Bible. The Greek term, kyriakos, is found, that adjective is found in the New Testament scriptures. It's found exactly 2 times. It is found in 1 Corinthians chapter 11, when the Apostle Paul is talking about when you come together, it is not for the Lord's Supper to eat. Basically using the word there, what we have is translated the Lord's Supper, the supper of the Lord. That of the Lord, that Lord's there, is kyriakos. The only other place that same adjective is found in the Greek New Testament is in Revelation chapter 1 and verse 10, I believe. And it is the Apostle John talking about being on the island of Patmos and that he was in the Spirit on the Lord's day. Once again, the Lord's, that day of the Lord is of the Lord portion. That Lord's portion is kyriakos. And that's it. Those are the 2 times that the word kyriakos is found in the Greek New Testament. But we have that term that moved forward in time and again made its way through various languages to work its way into our Old English, Middle English, and Modern English. Modern English is a span like 500 years or more, so we're talking about Modern English term has been around for hundreds of years. That form that we recognize and know as church, that's the word that is in our English language. That word church became a word that was focused upon in the English because of religious tradition and religious history. So that takes us back into what I've said before in a previous video about history matters. We have the historical development of here were the words used to express things in the Greek New Testament, and then as time moved forward, various terms were adopted, adapted, changed, whatever happened, to make them acceptable in religious terminology, and that religion reflects a historical development over centuries, so that by the time it was even possible to translate from the Greek New Testament into the English New Testament, even before it was possible in terms of legality, I mean. The first translation done from the Greek New Testament into English was done by William Tyndale, and he was a martyr for that. He paid for the work of translating the New Testament of the Bible into the English vernacular. Was an offense for which they hunted him down, tried him, convicted him, and brought him to being burned at the stake and strangled. And right before he died, he cried out, "Lord, open the King of England's eyes." That King of England, well, that's another story. So it was not even accepted. It was oppression and persecution directed at those who would look at bringing the New Testament into the language of the people and not in the language of the Roman Catholic Church. Translating into English, by the time things were done, even in a period of time where they were doing so at running afoul of the Roman Catholic religion, running afoul of the state, basically enforcing the will of the Roman Catholic Church, and moving forward from there, to where things became, in the Reformation in England, it's more socially acceptable to translate into the English language. We have that time frame, but by the time that happened, there were religious terms that had made their way from Greek to Latin that became part and parcel of certain principles and practices that were done in the English Roman Catholic Church. So translating into English, they utilized terms that were familiar in the day, and they did not translate the actual words and translate their meanings, but they brought things forward. Now, I'm kind of rehashing the history lesson. I've talked about that before. I've already talked about the fact that the adjective kyriakos in Greek refers to belonging to, of the Lord. I've mentioned the fact that that is the history of our English word. We derive church from kyriakos. And I'm not going to I'm not going to look it up in here just now. I've done that before. Maybe I'll have Beth put a screenshot up there up from the page from the definition. But there is quite a lengthy definition in this massive dictionary. This is Webster's Third New International Dictionary of the English Language, unabridged. As you can tell, it's a hefty tome. I forget its outer dimensions, but I can just tell you that I once just got curious and weighed this thing. It weighs more than 11 pounds. So, anyway, that reference gives us a definition of the word church. It references also the etymological history of the word and traces that back. So the word church was in existence for centuries before translating Greek into English was being done. And the word church, as it was used then, and even as we can see in definition today, the word church has a range of meaning. Out of all of those different meanings, referring to a building, referring to a denomination, referring to a profession like entering the profession of the church, all these different ranges of meanings have nothing to do with the biblical meaning of the word we find in our English translations. Actually, there are two meanings listed in the range of meanings in Webster's that approach a biblical concept, but they are not the primary or even secondary way in which English speakers commonly use the word church, or what people think of when they read it in their New Testament. Now, I've already said that the word church in both 1 Corinthians 11 and in Revelation chapter 1, the Greek word that eventually led us to the term church, kyriakos, its meaning is accurately translated of the Lord, belonging to the Lord. Not church, not building, not fellowship, not denomination, belonging to the Lord. And so you can say, well, wait a minute, something's wrong here. I open my New Testament, I read my Bible, and I see the word church all through it. And that's true. I forget what the numbers are in other versions. The Bible that, despite the fact that I like to study the words of Scripture in the original language of Greek and Hebrew, despite the fact that I'm making my own translation of the book of Acts even as we speak, for the better part of 30 years, the Bible I have as my most commonly referred to source is the New King James Version. I have a wide margin edition of the New King James Version that I've had since 1994, 1995, somewhere in there. So yeah, 30 years. And in that translation, you find the word church or churches, singular plural, a total of 110 times. I don't exactly remember what the number is in the King James Version or the New International Version. I don't remember researching it in other translations like New American Standard. I haven't done the work of looking at that in the Legacy Standard Bible of late or ESV or any of those. But the number is going to be slightly different, but essentially in the same category. There's, roughly speaking, well over 110 different places where the word church is found in our English versions. But that does not change the fact of what I've said, that the word kyriakos, from which we get church, means belonging to the Lord, and it only occurs 2 times in the New Testament. So let's talk about those 110 times. If you have the word church 110 times in an English translation of the New Testament, then if it's not referencing the actual origin of the word church, kyriakos, what is the term there? What is it referring back to? The word that it's referring back to is actually a Greek word, ekklesia. And that word ekklesia is found, like I said, 100 times plus in the New Testament. It's translated into English as church 110 times or thereabouts, depending on translation. Why is that different? It is different because the Greek word is different. The underlying Greek word is an altogether different word from which we derive the word church, ekklesia, and it does not have the same meaning. Ekklesia is an actual compound Greek word. Ek means out of or from. Kletos would be called, which is derived from the verb kaleo, to call. So ekkletos, ekklesia, is the origin of that word. So it basically means called out ones. And it was used of those called out of their homes or called out from one place to another, called out to public meeting for discussing business matters for the city state or whatnot. So that is the origin of that word, ekklesia. That is the basis of the word there. That word is found more than 100 times, and it is rendered as church. But it's like, here's one Greek word. Now we're going to substitute in English this word coming from a completely different Greek word so that we can have a different meaning attached to this. The very aspect of this that is found in our English Bibles is what I have called a bait and switch method by translators. I know that's not complimentary, but I stand by it because that's what has happened. You have one word which has a different meaning, and you've created that word church and attached certain meanings to it. And so when you come back to the New Testament, you find a different word, but you're not going to translate the meaning of that underlying word. You're going to substitute another one instead. So it is a bait and switch, a substitution thing that is happening when every time you see the word church in your English versions, that is a word that is a substitute for another word that has an altogether different meaning. And I refer back to the fact that called out ones is what ekklesia means. And it is an older Greek word that goes back to the time well before the time of Christ. The Greek city-states, they had a system whereby citizens would be called out from their homes to some public meeting place to discuss matters of business for the city-state, to assess a threat and determine whether it meant going to war, that kind of a thing. That was the origins of the term, which showcased that they were both called out ones, and those called out ones gathered together were an assembly. So both meanings are true of the word ekklesia. The called out ones assembled together, an assembly. And that was the way it was used in ancient Greek. You can even go to before the time of Christ, still before the time of Christ, but closer to it, around 250 AD, the Hebrew scriptures were commissioned to be translated into the Greek language. And there was a legend of how many were involved. The number generally given is 72. And so it is often referred to as the Septuaginta, which is basically 70. And that had to do with the books of Moses, the law, the Torah, if you will, the 5 books of Moses. And then in subsequent years and even the remaining centuries down to the time of Christ, the rest of the books of the Old Testament, as we think of them, were translated into Greek. So the Septuagint is not a monolithic thing per se. It's not all of a piece. It's not one single unit translated in one general time frame by the same translators and commissioned a team of translators, but it's the scriptures that we have. And it was the scriptures that even Jesus and the apostles had before them. In Aramaic speaking communities, they would go into the synagogue on the Sabbath and the scriptures would be read in Hebrew. But for many Jews that had been dispersed with all the captivities that were done through the centuries with the Chaldeans, with the Assyrians, Babylonians, the Persians, Rome, they were scattered throughout the world, and they increasingly were distanced from the language of Scripture. And so that began to be an important thing, and the Greek was the language of the day, the lingua franca, and so they were able to translate that into Greek and used. And when you compare this whole thing, you can look to the Hebrew word, and the Hebrew word, there's more than one, but the one that comes to mind off the top of my head is a Hebrew term kahal, which in general application in the Old Testament scriptures, it refers to congregation of Israel, or the assembly of the people as they are listening to Moses giving the instructions for them before they go into the land of promise, for example. So kahal essentially being translated either congregation or assembly. That is very consistently translated into the Greek translation, or was consistently translated in the Greek translations of the Hebrew scriptures as ekklesia. Now fast forward into New Testament times, and you have the term found as we find church in our Bibles. The underlying Greek word for that is not kyriakos, but ekklesia, and ekklesia is referring to those who are called out ones. The Apostle Peter spoke of those of believers being called out of darkness into his marvelous light. So Christians as individuals, Christians as a community, as a worldwide body, are called out of the world and called together, considered together as a worldwide body of Christ, an assembly. And then coming down a bit more local, if you will, there are references to ekklesia, assembly, that refers to the assembly in the Roman province of Asia, or the assembly in the province of Galatia. And then you can bring that further down still, moving more and more towards the local and the personal. You then have the ecclesia of God that is in Corinth, the ecclesia of Colossians, and so forth. And then take that down one step more, and you're talking about the ecclesia, the assembly of people that met in homes. Aquila and Priscilla, others, nymphas. There are different home assemblies that are mentioned, of either by mentioning the person whose house it was in, or mentioning the meeting in their homes. Just a quick inspection, I guess. All right, that's the essence of it. The word ekklesia, assembly, called out ones, kyriakos, belonging to the Lord. But when you go to the English New Testament, you have one word switched for another, one substitution for another, with a completely different word. And I just do not believe that it's accidental. It is very deliberate, because, again, as I say, by the time translation was an even acceptable thing to do into the English language, the term of church had already been an accepted term used in the Roman Catholic Church and in religious institutions to be referring to an institution, a building, and not so much referring to the people of God, the assembly of God, the community of believers. And so the term was the accepted religious term, and so rather than translating ecclesia by its literal meaning, they substituted a different word entirely in English so that they could retain the term that was already in religious favor. So that's the essence of this particular teaching. That is why I say church is not a biblical term, it is a religious term, and it should not be rendered as such in our English Bibles. It is all the time, but that is an unfortunate one. In my translations, you will not see me referring to church. You will see my translations referring to the assembly. Now, before I close out this video, all that I've just been speaking of off the top of my head, first of all, it's something I believe for a long time. I've even written on this for a long time. If I recall correctly, the first time I wrote an article about this subject was in 1999. And I have on my website, larryoverton.com, I have various articles. I have two that detail the word church, its history, and that substitutionary practice that was done. And then I have other articles written that deal with what the meaning of ekklesia is, going back to its origins in the Greek language, application in city state situations where they were the called out ones to an assembly of citizens for the discussing of business, to its use in the Old Testament in Greek, referring to the assembly of the people of Israel, and into the New Testament being assembly of believers, assembly. And there are two places, by the way, now that I'm thinking about it, there are two places where in the New Testament the word assembly, the word ekklesia, is used in a more classical Greek sense of a city meeting coming together. But I will leave all the details to be read in those. So you have a collection of something like 5 different articles that go into more detail and document all of the things that I've just been saying. I thank you for tuning into my channel, Reclaiming First Century Christianity. I thank you for bearing with me as I'm rambling on about this. And it just seems typical that this beagle hat. The length of our videos will probably be determined by that little beagle right there that comes in every now and again when he thinks I've talked long enough. But that's neither here nor there. Thank you for your time, and we'll see you in the next one.